Another game involving eggplants. Is this more than just a coincidence? Well, up next we've got Ice Climber. Super Mario Bros. Was the pinnacle release of the black box set in 1985. It was one of the main reasons the NES really took off in America, and it redefined many aspects of not only what made a good platformer, but made a good video game. Many of the games that came before it helped contribute to its ultimate design, including the arcade games Donkey Kong and Mario Bros, and Excitebike, which I touched on previously. I haven't talked about the arcade releases yet, as they came out on the NES in 1986. However, to make it extraordinarily simple, Donkey Kong introduced the idea of platforming as a movement-based game mechanic, jumping over barrels, while Mario Bros. Integrated it as a combative technique. Excitebike wasn't a platformer, but was one of the first Famicom games to implement side-scrolling, a technique that made movement feel seamless. All of these concepts, and a few more I'm sure I'm missing, combined to form what we know as Super Mario Bros. But before we had that, we had Ice Climber. From Excitebike onwards, these games shared a similar team. They were produced by Shigeru Miyamoto and Masayuki Uemura, and programmed by Kazuaki Morita and Toshihiko Nakago. The same team worked on Ice Climber. However, rather than it becoming the last big piece of the puzzle before Super Mario Bros., it seemed to me to be more of an attempt to utilize past mechanics to create the next big hit. Unfortunately, it didn't quite work out. The opening cutscene of Ice Climber involves a condor flying an eggplant to the top of a mountain. On a side note, eggplants have come up quite a bit in early Nintendo games, and at this point you might be wondering why. In Japan, Hatsuyume is the first dream of the new year. It's considered to be particularly good luck if one dreams of Mount Fuji, a hawk, and an eggplant, which would perfectly explain why a condor is bringing an eggplant up to the top of a tall mountain. The other eggplants present in Nintendo games can be drawn back to Yoshio Sakamoto and Toru Osawa. In an interview, they stated that, when they work together, they bring out each other's humor. For some reason, part of that humor involved eggplants. Sakamoto was a designer on Wrecking Crew and Kid Icarus, while Osawa created Kid Icarus and was influential on Sakamoto's earlier works. Both of these games feature eggplant-themed characters, so it seems that the Nintendo eggplant obsession was the result of two pranksters who thought they were funny. And I guess they were. But I digress. The goal of Ice Climber is to summit the mountain and retrieve the fruit taken by the condor. There are 2 parts to each level, 8 layers of ice blocks and a bonus stage. The first section involves breaking ice in the above layers in order to make enough room for the 2 titular characters, Popo, the blue Ice Climber, and Nana, the pink one, to jump up to the next level. Once they get a certain way up the screen, the camera will remain there, causing the player to lose a life if they fall below it. There are a few different enemies that appear, making this task more difficult. Topi are Yeti-like creatures that walk back and forth, sliding ice cubes into broken spaces to hinder the player's progress, while nitpickers fly down slowly and can be a real pain to avoid while jumping. Luckily, Popo and Nana have hammers to defend themselves against these enemies. They can smack it on the floor to kill Topi, and if nitpickers come into contact with the hammer on a jump, they also fall. The last major enemy is a polar bear. While there is no technical time limit on the first half of each stage, if the player is taking too long to progress, a polar bear will come along and force the screen to move a level upwards. Essentially, the polar bear functions as fireballs in Wrecking Crew or Mario Bros. Arcade do. It forces movement from the player, always keeping them on their toes. There are also a few environmental hazards the player has to remain aware of. Moving platforms, which the manual refers to as clouds, populate the mountain, as well as conveyor belt-like sections of moving floor that force the characters left or right while stepping on them. This conveyor belt-like floor actually pops up in Donkey Kong for the Famicom and later for the NES. It seems to me like some assets were reused to save time or money. If the player manages to get to the 9th floor, the bonus stage begins. This one is timed and includes no enemies, but it's not required to beat in order to pass a level. If the 5th bonus stage is reached, then the player has the chance to earn an extra life by collecting a piece of corn. However, because every stage can be accessed from the main screen, dying isn't much of a concern. The only thing that would be lost is a high score. As you can probably tell by watching the gameplay footage, Ice Climber was a game based in the vertical plane. The entire point of the game is to get to the next floor, which is located vertically above you. After all, you're scaling a mountain. However, Because the same jump physics are used in it and Mario Bros, it feels very clunky. Mario Bros didn't need to implement horizontal jump physics. Tight jumps weren't that important, as the platforms present in the stage were quite large. The same could not be said for Ice Climber. Many times, the player has to perform jumps that land them from a moving platform to a single tile of floor. The jump physics presents a noticeable problem here. It's not possible to change the momentum of your jump in midair, meaning that whatever amount of horizontal speed was put into the beginning of the jump carries through to the action. This becomes incredibly frustrating, especially in later stages. It's exacerbated by poor collision detection, especially with the moving platforms. Oftentimes, a jump looks like it should make it, as Popo's sprite is above the platform, and then he falls right through. Because you can't jump through any types of platforms, these design choices cause diagonal movement, the basis of the entire game, to feel painful. It is important to remember that these frustrations in platforming were the norm for the time. Ice Climber was, by pre-Super Mario Bros. Standards, a fine game. But playing this after experiencing the smooth controls of Mario makes it feel like a massive downgrade in quality. It seems like the team working on the game realized the failings and decided to try out a few new things for their next big project. Instead of working vertically, Super Mario Bros. Is a side-scroller, akin to the likes of Excitebike. They reworked both the jump momentum and platform collisions, making successful jumps feel earned and diminishing the amount of times the player hits a platform only to seemingly pass through it. The main issue is that both Ice Climber and Super Mario Bros. Were launch titles for the NES. While Japan got to see the progression of the platforming genre between the two games, as Ice Climber predated Mario by almost an entire year, America was given both at the same time. Action series games retailed for $25 in the US, but accounting for inflation, that's $68 today. Games were expensive, limiting most families to choosing only one title. It's just undeniable that Mario was more bang for your buck than Ice Climber. Ice Climber is another title that Nintendo has coddled since its release. Of course, the Famicom Disk System received a port of Versus Ice Climber, a much beefier version of the original Famicom cart, adding a super bonus stage, an additional 16 levels, and a counter to keep track of which player, if any, conquered the mountain. It got e-reader cards during the retro resurgence of 2002, as well as a port to the Game Boy Advance as part of the classic NES series. It's also been ported to every eShop that Nintendo's made, ranging from the Wii to the Switch. Most notably, Popo and Nana are playable characters in Super Smash Bros. Melee and Smash Ultimate, where they each have their own mountain-themed stage complete with polar bear and moving cloud platforms. While many people recognize the theme and character from these re-releases, the actual gameplay of Ice Climber has fallen into relative obscurity, and for good reason. The game didn't have much of a legacy outside of the fact that it was the last platformer to come out before Super Mario Bros. Regardless, it did certainly play an important role in creating the prize jewel of the Black Box series, and that's important in its own right.